This week, something really cool happened. You probably saw it in the news. In fact, I know a lot of you did, because you all emailed me about it. I actually wasn't planning on making this video. I decided to do it impromptu, going off script too. Companies have paired up to go down to the bottom of the Atlantic and photograph the Titanic wreck from thousands and thousands of different angles, and then use computer software to stitch this all together and build a hyper-realistic digital twin Titanic. This is the first time anything like this has ever actually been done to the Titanic. It's a really exciting time. What we're going to do today is answer a couple questions: what this technology actually is, what it means, and then we're actually going to look at some of the footage from the model and see what it can tell us about the wreck of the Titanic and identify a few things here, and they're very exciting. So first of all, what actually is the technology? It sounds straightforward, but it really isn't. What they do is they take hundreds if not thousands of photographs of an object and then use computer software to analyze the data and the viewpoints from which the photographs were taken and then build a 3D model of whatever they were taking pictures of. Usually you can do this to landscapes or buildings or shipwrecks. If you actually go to the website Sketchfab, you'll see a lot of free 3D models that you can spin around and look at. One of these in particular demonstrates this technique really well. It's the wreck of the Cornelia B. Windy. It was a 3-masted schooner. It sank in the Great Lakes, and actually did a video on this last week, and they've made a hyper-realistic model of the ship, and someone didn't actually sit down and sculpt this 3D model. This uses the technology they've just used on the Titanic called photogrammetry, so you can familiarize yourself. You can see that it's a little bit blurry in some areas, and maybe a little bit misshapen, but it gives you a good general indication of what the wreck of this ship looks like down there, and you can go and spin around and have a look at it. I'll put a link to this model in the description of my video. Now, the reason this is important is because if you've ever seen a picture of Titanic's wreck in full, it's either one of two things. It's either a photo mosaic or it's either a painting. Back in the day when they first discovered Titanic in 1985, Robert Ballard and his team went back to the wreck and started photo mapping it from stem to stern, the bow section, so the forward half of the Titanic after it broke into two. The forward half, the Titanic, is definitely the most photographed part of the wreck, and this photo mosaic was first published, I think, in National Geographic magazine, and you can tell that it was actually stitched together from hundreds of different pictures of the Titanic. And the reason for this is that when they have submarines going down to the wreck of the ship, the capsules that they actually put the cameras in to take pictures have to be watertight, because obviously down there the crushing depths of the ocean at about 3,000 meters or 13,000 feet, it's 3 kilometers straight down, it'll just crush the air out of the camera and destroy it. So these capsules have to be built to withstand unbelievable amounts of water pressure. Now, in the case of the Titanic, this means that you can only take very, very small photographs. It's kind of like photographing the side of a building, but only taking postage stamp-sized pictures every time. And then what they have had to do to get an idea of the full scope and scale of the wreck and see what's going on, they stitched these all together into mosaics. One of the most famous was those published in National Geographic, and then in about 2010 there was another photo mosaic put together, I think, for National Geographic off the top of my head, that showed the Titanic in full. Now, this is all well and good for a general understanding of what the shipwreck looks like, but it has a few caveats. This relies on essentially like photo artistry to be able to stitch back together all of these pictures, and sometimes they don't totally line up. So in the case of the 2010 photo mosaic, you can actually see instances where there's too few or too many windows, and unfortunately conspiracy theorists have used this to support their Titanic and Olympic switch theory idea, which is ridiculous. They're just artifacts from the process. My favorite artifact from this whole process is you can actually see towards the bottom of the rack. There's a window frame that looks massive, but this window is just from the D-deck dining saloon, and these were not that big. This is like the size of life raft or bigger, so there's still a lot of area for human error to slip in here. Now, the second thing that you would have seen a lot of are paintings, specifically those by artist Ken Marshall. Now, Ken Marshall is a hero of mine. He's a hero of the channel and a lot of different people who are familiar with the Titanic story. Ken's paintings are basically photo realistic, and what he's relied on in the past is photographs back from these expeditions that he's himself stitched together in his mind basically and painted his interpretation of the evidence and the data into really accurate paintings of the Titanic's wreck, which are really cool. But what these two things have in common is that into them can be slipped human error or misinterpretation. What photogrammetry allows us to do is look at the Titanic wreck exactly as it is. It shines a light on the entire 360-degree scope of this shipwreck. Why is this important? Why should you even care? It's been 110 years since the Titanic. Who cares? Sank. What's all to do with the historic record? See, this may not come as any surprise to you or any great shock, but misinformation, fake history, and fake news are really crept into the narrative thanks to things like social media. Means that there are a lot of people out there who believe that the Titanic and the Olympic are identical sister ship, was swapped, that it was part of an insurance scam. This impact the families of people involved because it basically paints their ancestors as villains, and it corrupts the historic record. We have ample evidence that this was categorically impossible, and yet people still believe it. So by removing as much conjecture as possible, as much human error and the artist's approach, taking that away and looking at cold hard facts, we can get a really strong sense of the historic record, what actually happened and that night the Titanic sank, and then also what's going to happen to it in the future. So that's enough of a preamble. Let's have a look at some of the things that they've published and see what they can actually tell us about the wreck. Let's go. Okay, so this comes from the BBC reporting of the event. This is from Titanic Wreck Tour Start, the YouTube page. Go on, subscribe. I guess we're going to look at some of the scans and what they actually mean. So the first thing I do is show this size comparison of the Titanic. You can see the BBC reporter standing down there on the bottom. This is why it's been so difficult to accurately photo map of the Titanic, because it's just so big laying down there on the sea floor. This is the photogrammetry model of the ship you can see already, but it is highly detailed, very exciting. It's my favorite shot. Again, you can just see how big this thing is. So the first thing, boat deck forward, that we get to look at here is a section of the port side of the ship, or the left-hand side, and you can actually see the hull here, and then we're going to fly up and over the top. Alrighty, this is telling me a lot of really interesting things. You can see that the boat deck is being basically eaten through slowly. There's a lot of holes appearing all over the deck here, and there's whole sections of it that have actually collapsed. So that's kind of unpack this already. If I just take it back a little bit to the first opening shot here, these are the decks of the Titanic essentially. So we've got the boat deck, which is the uppermost deck, the ADK promenade, which is the one below it, and then B deck. So these big square windows along here were kind of unique to Titanic in that the Olympic just had those big square windows at the time running the entire length, because on Olympic this area was just an empty promenade deck where you could go for a stroll. On the Titanic, this huge stretch of promenade was actually replaced by the most expensive and luxurious cabins put on Titanic. Titanic had these, Olympic didn't, which is what contributed to Titanic's size difference to the Olympic. Another big difference between Titanic and Olympic was the fact that Titanic's deck promenade, which is up here, was very famously closed off forward. They kind of late in the ship's construction installed some screens and created a space where first-class passengers could stroll without being subjected to the elements, because remember that promenade down on B deck had essentially been deleted. Unfortunately, on the Titanic wreck, because of these scans, we can see that the deck promenade has been crushed, because boat deck above it has come down like a layer cake, just collapsing. And what's kind of causing this is the fact that this is the very extreme edge of the part where Titanic tore in half. So this is the end of the bow section, the back of the bow section where Titanic actually broke up on the night it sank. This is all collapsed down here. Park Stevenson, who's a maritime researcher and an engineer, has reported back that on some of his findings of other shipwrecks like the USS Johnston, that damage sustained on the Johnston back in World War II has caused those areas of the ship to decay and corrode and rust away a lot faster. And we can see that on the Titanic, that it's the rear end of the boat deck and getting closer to the tear. The bits of the ship are being eaten away. These kind of like pole things hanging down here are stanchions. These would have supported Titanic's boat deck above, and you can see them on the Olympic, but on the Titanic they were plated over the screens that had the windows on it. Deck have been eaten away by corrosion. This is unfortunate, but these screens, they weren't structural, they weren't made of very thick steel at all, they were really just to kind of like shield the passengers from the sea spray, so it's that kind of thin material that's being eaten away at a much faster rate. This is true of the boat deck as well, so actually play this little animation real quick. We can see that we're getting now a view over where the Titanic's second funnel would have once stood. This is some of the thinnest metal used on the Titanic, which was around things that weren't necessarily, like I said, structural, so they weren't designed to support heavy loads. So the deck plating, especially, we can see there are huge holes here where that's just being eaten away. Interestingly, here we can just see there's a lifeboat, David, lying on its side that's just been knocked over. This is really interesting. This is the entrance for the first class grand staircase, and this is the boat deck level, and it's just collapsed. The roof has collapsed. Unfortunately, there's a huge hole where the grand staircase dome once would have sat, but all this would have once been the same height as the roof of the officers' quarters over here on the left, so you can see that's just collapsed down, and this is just a mess. The base of the second funnel is really badly corroded and collapsed, and that's probably because of the collapse of the second funnel on the night the Titanic sank. Remember, where you see areas of advanced decay where the ship is basically corroding faster, it's probably where it was damaged on the night the Titanic sank. This probably means the second funnel caused quite a lot of damage when it came down, and amongst all this carnage, this looks really bad. From up here you can see things that are really well preserved, so you can see the base of a Sirocco vent fan here. These were the big fans that pulled air down into the ship or pulled stale air out. You can see a big ventilator here that's in basically perfect condition. Looks like that would almost still work if you just kind of like dusted it off. And over here we've got a like really nicely preserved electric winch that would have been used to pull like the lifeboats up once they'd been lowered if they needed to retrieve any of the boats. It's just sad that this entrance has collapsed totally. The grand staircase clock was so famous from the films, and everything would have sat right here, but fortunately this has given explorers unfettered access to some of the areas forward of that, because you've got two doorways here, one left and then one right, that lead forward into some of the first class cabins that were up here, and then also the officers' quarters where the ship's offices stayed. This back here is a complete mess. This would have once been the roof of the first class lounge, and that has completely gone. It's gutted. The first class lounge is gone. Whatever was blow it on BDX DAC DDEX has collapsed, so this is very clearly where Titanic lost all structural integrity after the break, and that part of the ship has just gone down and fallen apart. Now we're moving along here to the area just behind the first funnel, and there's a couple interesting things here that are still really well preserved, and other things that aren't so much. So you can see the base of the first funnel, and what's really interesting about this area, this is the first funnel that collapsed on the night of the Titanic sinking. You can actually see there's two layers. You can see this thing here, and then an outer ring. So the outer ring was what was referred to as the outer funnel. I know, very creative, and this is the thing that you see in any photograph of the Titanic. It's instantly recognizable, the white star buff, that kind of yellowy gold looking color, and then the black band on top. That was the outer funnel that actually protected the inner funnel, which was actually what was carrying up all the gases and things being expelled from the ship's boilers that ran really hot, and so that was separated by a bit of a distance. You can see in photographs of Titanic and Olympic's funnels that they have two layers, and you can actually see that still down here on the rack. Inexplicably perfectly preserved behind the funnel is a water tank that still looks good, while behind that one of the vents that ran all the way down into the ship's boilers. Now the roof has collapsed or just been eaten away. What's interesting, and you'll see this a lot around the Titanic's wreck, is that the wood planking is gone. So Titanic's decks were planked in various types of wood, so you had pine and then also teak wood. Teak is extremely solid and will survive a very long time on the sea floor. The Bismarck's teak wood decks are still there. On Titanic it was often used for margin planking, so that was like the edges of the ship's decking, while the pine wasn't so tough and often got eaten away by microbes first. So you can actually see here that the edges of the deck here probably teak margin planks, and they're still intact, so that wood is still there, but the planking that would have run along here is long gone. You can see these little dots all the way along. These are the huge rivets or studs that would have held those deck planks in place. So although the timber is gone, you can still see where they would have had these essentially like giant bolts sort I've secured them to the ship's deck. You can see the bases of some of the ventilators here. They're all like, kind of torn up and badly damaged. What's really interesting is this one down here on the bottom. It looks like it's been unseated, so that's just been completely ripped up and off its base, but you can see around it, some of the concrete base is still there. They actually set these things in concrete on the Titanic's deck. If you play the game Titanic Honor and Glory, you can load up the demo, and you can see that there are areas where there's just concrete, and that's what the ventilators are actually sitting on. And you can very clearly see that here. It's very cool. There was some talk earlier about retrieving Titanic's wireless set. The Titanic's wireless set was below the skylight, and that skylight would have provided fresh air and light straight down into the ship's wireless room. You can see that the roof around it is slowly being eaten away. It's really interesting, this pattern, that it's kind of stemming out from here. This room, specifically, is actually the machinery room for the ship's elevators, and you can tell, because the circular thing here is actually the base of a huge ventilator that would have provided a fresh outflow or inflow of air, because the elevators were directly blown as they go up and down. They kind of create a draft, and you need to be able to get air in and out as they're going. The fact this is being eaten away first from the middle out is kind of interesting. I don't know if this was damaged on the night of the sinking or what have you, but it's just an interesting little pattern. It's sad to say, unfortunately. Over here on the right hand side of the ship, the starboard side, that was once the ship's gymnasium, and that is totally gone. That's just the roof has collapsed. That's in really bad shape. You can see the decks going down. Amazing. This is amazing stuff. You can see the decks going down through the Grand